Hey everyone, so welcome to the next class in Intro to Political Science. So last time we kind of reviewed some of the basic concepts in political science. Today we're going to go and look at the nation state or the state or country, and we'll talk about kind of the difference between the different terms. But for the most part, people globally are organized by states or by countries, right? So you could live in Canada, the US, China, Russia, South Africa, Argentina, Brazil, Egypt. So you could live in any of these different countries, but the way that we organize kind of politics is internationally is based on the concept of countries or states. So today we're going to talk a little bit about kind of this different organization, what it means, what does it mean to be a state, what does it mean to live within a state, a little bit about kind of some of the differences, and then because so much of at the end of the course, we'll talk about relations between states, but also kind of throughout the much of the rest of the course, we're going to look at kind of the politics within states. So what are the different ways that politics can be organized depending on kind of, the different setup of the state. So some countries, for example, like Canada, have different provinces. Some don't have provinces or kind of smaller regional organizations. Some have parliamentary democratic governments, some have presidential democratic, some have non-democratic government forms. So states are organized in different ways. So once we understand kind of more or less what the state is, we can start going forward into how are they organized internally. So today's class is based largely off of chapter 2 from the readings. The goals are to discuss the nature of the modern state and explain how the modern state developed, explain the difference between a nation and a state, discuss the significance of nationalism and national self-determination, examine the meaning of citizenship, and outline the nature and significance of globalization. So at the very beginning, I just wanted to start with, so states kind of operate within kind of international politics. So when we look within a state, we're talking about domestic politics, so politics at home. When we're talking about kind of relations between states, we're talking about international politics. And so if we're talking about multiple states, we could be comparing across them. That's typically, if you're comparing different types of states, that's typically viewed as, referred to as comparative politics. If you're looking at relations between states, you're talking about, that would be kind of the area of international politics. Then if you're looking within a particular state itself, so if you're looking in, if we're looking inside Canada, that would be referred to as Canadian politics. So kind of your subfields of political science. You'd have international politics, comparative politics. So no matter what country you're studying political science in, you'd have a comparative politics and you'd have a international politics. And then usually you'd have kind of a more in-depth look at the country that you live in. So in Canada, we have a lot of political scientists who work on Canadian politics. In the States, they have a lot of people who work on American politics. In the UK, they'd have a lot of people work on British politics. But because we're talking about today kind of what states are, before we can start comparing across them or looking more deeply at the Canadian case, we want to kind of look at just a little kind of landscape of what is the terrain that, that states operate in, right? So states are what we call an international actor, and that it simply means any person or body whose decisions and actions have repercussions for international politics, right? So for relations across international actors. So it could be any person or body. When we're talking about states, we're talking about bodies whose decisions and actions have repercussions for international politics. So means something for kind of the world. So who are these international actors who can affect international politics? Well, we're going to talk a lot about states today, but we're also later, near the end, when we talk about globalization, we're going to talk a little bit about some non-state actors too. They'll recur more near the end of the course when we briefly touch into international politics. But at the end of the course, at the end of today's lecture, we'll also talk a bit about globalization, and some of these other ones will be operating. So when we talk about kind of international politics, so things that cross boundaries, so politics that cross boundaries. We have states obviously operating. So Canada has diplomacy with the United States, or you could have United States could have a conflict with China or Russia or Iran. you could have economic ties. So Canada could sign an kind of a free trade agreement with the U.S. and Mexico. So certainly states could be operating across borders or having politics that transcend borders, but so can many other type of actors, and we typically refer to these as non-state actors. So it could be multinational corporations, so very big corporations that have activities across more than one country. And so you could think of Walmart, Toyota, McDonald's, Samsung, Apple. They not only sell across multiple countries, but often have factories producing goods in multiple countries. And so they have a large presence internationally. International organizations, so things like the UN or OPEC, which would be the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. So these are organizations that bring different governments together to make decisions. So most countries in the world are members of the United Nations, and they come together to make decisions about different international concerns. OPEC is an organization that brings together multiple oil exporting countries, and they come together to talk about supply issues, pricing issues for oil. And then you have non-governmental organizations. So these are organizations that operate across boundaries. So they belong in international politics, but they don't involve governments. The memberships aren't made up of governments. So things like Amnesty International, Greenpeace, the Red Cross. So you could sign up and become a member of many of these different organizations. Some of them work just have kind of domestic chapters that work on issues at home. So many of these ones, many of these international or non-governmental organizations you could join have chapters that are just looking, say, at Canadian issues, but they also have, they also work with their sister organizations in other countries to be working on more widespread, to be working on global issues. So we'll return to a little bit of them in the end, but it's important to remember when we're talking about states, that states aren't operating alone. They're not the only actors. They're not the only groups making decisions kind of in international politics that cross boundaries. So what's a state? So we've been saying states a lot so far, but it's useful to give a definition to what we're talking about here. So the state is an independent, self-governing political community whose governing institutions have the capability to make rules that are binding on the population within a particular territory. And they have another definition being a political unit that has two crucial characteristics, territoriality and sovereignty. And we'll return to both of territoriality and sovereignty in a second. So independent, and that's tied up in the sovereignty concept, self-governing community. So it's a community of people that self-govern, so it has governing institutions, and makes rules that are binding on the population within a territory. So there's a lot of things that are occurring. So within a particular territory, and territoriality then in the second definition. So a state always has a defined territory. So if you look at the map of the world, you can see like Canada has specific lines that you could draw the boundaries, that you know this particular bit of territory within Canada, this territory is outside of Canada, and so you know where the boundaries are. So all states in the world should have fixed boundaries. There's sometimes conflict over them when you have international disputes. There could be some fuzzy boundaries sometimes, but or disputed boundaries sometimes, but more or less, you should be able to look at a nice solid line and you know, if I cross this line, I'm in this country. If I cross this line, I'm in this country. If I cross this line, I'm in this different country. So there's a defined boundary for each of these different communities, and all the communities are independent and self-governing communities. So it means they're absent outside interference, so they're independent, and they have control over their own territory. So they can set the rules for what happens within the territory. So Canada can set the rules for what happens within Canada. The Canadian community can self-rule what happens with what people do within the territory, and it's not influenced in making decisions over kind of how to rule itself, how to make it set rules. Nobody from outside is telling them what to do. And that's the concept of sovereignty. So territoriality, meaning fixed territory, and then sovereignty, meaning control over the territory that you have the ability to self-govern or to make rules that are binding on the population. So that's referring to sovereignty. So again, sovereignty of states has two basic dimensions. We already touched a little bit on both. So states claim to be the highest authority for their population and their territory, right? So the right to make rules. So the state has the right to make rules over what is acceptable and unacceptable within the particular territory, and independent, right? States are not subject to any external influence. So no other country or group could come in and say, this is how you should be running your territory. So Americans don't get to tell Canadians, you know, this is the government you should pick. Canadians don't get to tell Americans, this is the government you should pick. It's why foreigners don't get votes in elections. So Americans don't get votes in Canadian elections, and Canadians don't get votes in American elections. It's why many politicians you'll see when there's an election, even if they have a preferred candidate, they'll typically be very diplomatic in saying who they want to win. Partially it's because if the other side, say Trudeau says he prefers Biden to win. Well, partially if Trump had won, that could cause problems for Trudeau in terms of moving politics forward. But partially it's because of the concept of independence. You're not supposed to get involved in the politics of another country. Even as a political scientist, I'll typically, even when I studied in the US, I had political opinions. I'd share it with friends, but I was tried to be as careful as possible, particularly in election season, to not be pushing a particular side. Even if my friends or even if in social media I made it clear where I stood, there's a difference between pushing something and having an opinion. And if it's about Canadian politics, it doesn't matter. I'm a Canadian citizen. So I can have whatever political opinions and push people to vote however I want in my private life. But in terms of foreign elections, as a Canadian, it's not my place to tell another country how they should be voting. And that goes doubly so for governments. Part of sovereignty then is the principle of sovereign equality. So all states are viewed as legally equal regardless of difference in power. So some states are stronger than others, but kind of the principle of sovereignty means that, at least from a legal perspective, all states are equal. All states have the same right to be within the territory that is theirs. So within the territory that is assigned kind of to their state. They have the right to make the rules they have the right to be the highest authority for the population within that territory, and to be free from external influence in terms of what rules they put in place. So that's the concept of sovereign equality. All states, at least in terms of sovereignty, their legal status as sovereign, are equal. They could be unequal in many, many, many different other ways, but at least in terms of legal status of a sovereignty are equal. So how many states are in the world? So the number of states has grown considerably in the last decades. So first, states are relatively, from the history of the world, a relatively recent phenomenon. The kind of the modern nation, the modern state, as we think of it, was born in 1648, which sounds like a long time ago, but if you think about how long humans go back, it's not particularly long. But at the end of the 30 Years' War, which is a very violent war in Europe, you don't need to know 1648 or 30 Years' War for this course, just to give you kind of a context. But at that point, states were very, very limited to Western Europe in particular, to the European context. So the concept of states were born in Europe. And then it took a long time for it to spread to many other parts of the world for a variety of different reasons. Partially, other regions were already had different ways of organizing their politics. And the concept of states emerged in Western Europe or in Europe because of a particular set of contexts or circumstances, a particular war with a particular set of circumstances that led to this creation. Without those circumstances in other political regions of the world, they didn't necessarily have the need to organize in the same way, have the same political organization. Second reason was colonialism. So European states over the centuries started, colonizing and taking over more and more different regions in the world. And because that precluded those different regions from developing states, because by necessity, if you're a colony of another country, you can't have full sovereignty because you don't have complete control over what happens in your country, and you're not free from external influence. So colonialism also hampered the spread of states from outside of the Western world. So it did come to, say, certain places outside the Western world, came to North America slightly earlier in the United States and then Canada. But to go to many other places in the world, it took longer. So if we look here, there was, in 1950, there was approximately 60 nation states. And then now there are 193 members, at least in 2018, of the United Nations. Now, there are some states that aren't members of the United Nations, but most are. So that's a fairly good indication of how many states there are in the world. So how did it grow so much from about 60 in 1950 to 193 in 2018? Well, there's two major increases. First, in the period from 1950 to about 1990, where you see a steady increase, that goes with the period of decolonization. So more and more after World War II, it was viewed as unacceptable to have colonies. So over time, different countries were able to, or different colonies were able to gain their independence from the European colonizer, whoever it may have been, and gain sovereignty over their newfound state. The other major jump that you see is around 1990 with the fall of the Soviet Union. So there's an immediate jump of some of the states that were part of the Soviet Union gained independence. So went from Soviet Union to kind of independence and so sovereignty over their own territory. So that's where you see that kind of immediate spike upwards. A slower increase as decolonization, there's fewer and fewer colonies or protectorates or whatnot around the world. So the pace of state growth has slowed. You now have, sometimes from secessionist movements, you'll get new states, so states splitting apart in two, because different groups want to go their own way. So it's largely slowed, and probably will remain slow for quite a while. The state is not the same thing as a government. So the state, a government is a set of institutions, including politicians, that make decisions and oversee their implementation on behalf of the state for a particular period of time, right? So there's a difference between Canada, which is a state, and the Canadian government. The Canadian state is stable. The Canadian state is just the idea that within this particular territory, whoever is in charge of it, whatever the governing institutions are at that particular time, they have the authority to set the rules. They're sovereign over that territory. The government is just the particular set of institutions and institutional setup that exists in the country at the time. So Canada hasn't always had the same set of institutions across its history. Many countries have even had many more different transformations in their institutions, from going from non-democracy to democracy, maybe to a semi-democracy or a weak democracy, back to a full democracy. So they've had a lot of different changes in institutions, but also just change in politicians, right? When we elected a new government in Canada, that means there's a change in politicians. It means there's a change in leader, a change in government, not a change in the state itself. So the state kind of endures as long as sovereignty and territoriality are not affected. So it's the government at that time is a set of institutions that oversees implementation that makes rules at any particular time within the state. So now, are all states successful? And that brings us to the concept of failed states. So a state that's unable to enforce laws, maintain order, protect the lives of citizens, and provide basic services can be referred to as a failed state. So it's a state that may have territoriality. So it's a state that, like say, the international community may have agreed, should be sovereign within a particular area. So it's got territoriality, at least in theory. But in practice, the government within that territory is unable to either maintain control or set the rules over that entire territory. In some cases, may not even be able to maintain control over much of the territory at all. So it oftentimes it could be there's a government that's operating, say, in the capital and within particular regions, and they have more or less are able to enforce laws, maintain order, and protect the lives of citizens and provide basic services within those areas they control. But then there's a band of, it could be warlords, it could be rebel groups, it could be terrorist organizations, or sometimes nobody controls certain portions of the territory. And so the government's not able to do all of those different functions of sovereignty within that territory. So we'd say it's a failed state. So you could think of, during the recent kind of civil war, you could think of Syria, right? The government at different times had control over portions of the territory and can maintain these services and these functions of sovereignty within those areas. But within many other areas, those functions were more being done by rebel organizations or by ISIS at different times. Somalia is another example where the government at many different times has had limited success in controlling large portions of its territory, where different warlords have actually been the ones who control larger segments of the territory. And so we refer to these as failed states because they're not able to maintain the requirements for territoriality, so a defined territory where with sovereignty, where you have control over said territory. Many countries, state institutions only have a weak governing capacity and can be termed as fragile states, right? So a fragile state is not necessarily one that's failed. So the government may have control over the entire territory. So they may currently have sovereignty over the entire territory. But the institutions are very weak, that any form of challenge to it, they may not be able to meet it. So oftentimes, if we're thinking here of poorer states, and they may just not have the resources, that if there's any problems that emerge in any of the outlying regions of the country, they may not have the roads to get there or the resources to be able to handle the problem. So they're ones that currently are, say, holding steady, but that could become failed states if given the proper push, say. And then not to speak of them necessarily as fragile, but even things like sovereignty and territoriality, even for richer states, can sometimes be more problematic. So one of the things that the different Arctic states are competing over right now is control over seabed resources. and control over different Arctic territories, but particularly kind of mapping the different seabeds, so finding the different continental shelves, so who has control over what portions of the Arctic Ocean. Feeling being that the Arctic Ocean will be full of many different resources, and if you don't have and so having control over that territory, having exclusive rights to the resources within that territory or that portion of the seabed could be very, very profitable. So one of the questions that's always come up for Canada in kind of mapping the seabed, but not just even in terms of mapping the seabed, but even in terms of our northern land territories or Northwest Passage, is we claim the territories, and it's on the map. If you look at the map, say all of those different islands up in the high north are considered Canada. But if there's any emergency there, does Canada have the capacity to reach up there? If there was any invasion, any military occupation or force that tried to take any of that territory from us, do we have the capacity to fight back? Do we really have control over those territories? Do we really have the ability to, or the capacity to control what happens there, to set the rules for what's going to happen there and enforce them? And we can make whatever claims we want, but some have kind of put forward the phrase "use it or lose it," right? If we're not able to show the capacity to be able to use the Arctic, then we could start seeing greater pushes to our claims of sovereignty over the territory, and we could potentially lose some of those claims. So even a country like Canada, which is one of the wealthiest countries in the world, is one of the more powerful countries in the world, can face issues when it comes to sovereignty. So when do we violate sovereignty? Because challenges to sovereignty happen many times. Now, they can happen internally. So in many failed states, the states didn't fail because of an external intervention or an external war. It happens because of civil war. So groups within the state are discontent. They challenge the government for control, and the state collapses for that reason. But sovereignty does get violated sometimes from the outside as well. So first, remember we said that states have sovereign equality. So under the law, they have the equal rights to be free from external interference. In application, that's a nice legal principle. In application, stronger states can do more of what they want, and weaker countries can sometimes, if the interest of the, if it's in the interest of the stronger state to interfere in the weaker state, either by telling the government what to do, influencing who the government is, or just taking resources or territory from that weaker state. Sovereign equality is a nice legal term that on the battlefield has next to no real effect, right? A legal principle is not going to win you wars unless it gets people to fight on your side. So in principle, if a stronger states, despite sovereign equality, despite the principle of sovereignty, despite the principle of non-intervention, stronger states have interfered many times since the principle of sovereign equality has been created in weaker states. And there's nothing the weaker state can really do about it. So power still matters. Beyond power, there's also sometimes the more benign, although sometimes still misused and sometimes still helpful. So the more hotly debated in terms of, most people will say that uses of power are will look down. We shouldn't be using power to intervene in other states, but it's a fact of life. The more debated one as to whether it's good or bad is this next classification for violating sovereignty. And we can put it under kind of the umbrella of responsibility to protect. So various elements of the international community have intervened in sovereign states to protect human rights. So there's some arguments that are said that sovereignty for a government only extends so far. So governments are, say, stewards of the state's right to sovereignty, but if the government's abusing the people who exist within the state, then that government, say, has abandoned its duties to those people, and has given up kind of its claim to authority. And so because it's no longer kind of the proper steward of the state's sovereignty, then it's acceptable for external actors to intervene to reestablish a government that respects the rights of the people. This is more debated. The proponents to this will say that interfering to protect human rights is our duty as humans, that sovereignty doesn't give a government carte blanche to do whatever they want. There's not limits on the idea of sovereignty. You can't just hide behind sovereignty and do whatever you want in terms of abusing people. The flip side is that who defines what is human rights, who defines what is oppression, and these violations, who gets to intervene, who gets to decide to intervene. Every country has negative things they do in terms of human rights. So does that mean everybody could be, if you've got your own problems, who are you to judge the problems of others? There's a lot of politics that can go into interventions. They don't always have the benefits that they're claimed to have. So there's a lot of politics that can go into this when we get to intervene to protect human rights. The UN mandated that there is a collective international responsibility to protect people if genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity are involved. So there are particular situations where international law does mandate intervention. So genocide, that the mass killing of people, all of these from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity are different versions of mass executions of people within a state. So think World War II with the Holocaust is an example of a genocide. There's been other examples of genocides or war crimes or ethnic cleansing, but where one group or multiple groups are systematically being targeted for killing within a state. In cases like this, the government has kind of principle of protecting human lives and protecting humans supersedes the principle of sovereignty. And so it's therefore right for the international community to come in and intervene. So in common language and sometimes within academic or media language, you'll sometimes see these following terms used interchangeably, which can lead to sometimes to some confusion. So we'll sometimes see country, state, nation, and nation state used interchangeably. The last two, for reasons that we'll get into, can be problematic, being used in this as kind of synonym for country and state. We'll get into those problems. So I encourage you not to use nation or nation state unless you're being very careful as to the meaning. State and country, largely within kind of academic speak, we use state more commonly. Outside of the academic context, country may be the preferable term because state can lead to, at least within the North American context, can lead to confusion as to whether we're talking about like state as in like Canada or the US, or we talk about state as in like New York or California or Florida or Washington state, with like kind of the US context of state being similar as a political division, like a province type thing. So for that reason, state can be a little bit more confusing, but within kind of the academic, in this course, I will use state the most frequently. Country sometimes, almost never nation or nation state for this to refer to as a country. So why is nation problematic? You'll see nation used. You used to see nation used a lot more. I think a lot people have kind of caught on to, more and more to the problems. It's something that, as Canadians, particularly as Quebecois, you should catch on to the problem with nation as a term for country. You should catch on to those problems quite intuitively. So a nation, sociologically speaking, is a group of people who have a sense of common identity and who typically believe they should be self-governing within their homeland. So it's people who have a common identity. It could be based on race, religion, common heritage within a particular territory, and they believe that not only that they have this common identity, but that that identity is tied to a particular piece of territory. A sense of national identity exists where people with ties to a territory share common characteristics. Yeah, so ethnicity, language, culture, religion, or shared experience. So, for example, Quebec, many political scientists, politicians, sociologists, or just members of the public would admit that Quebec is a nation, right? So Quebec meets all of these different characteristics, right? It's a group with a shared national identity based on language, in particular language, culture, and shared experience. To a lesser extent, perhaps religion, and certainly tied to a particular territory. So we could certainly define Quebec as a nation, but Quebec is not a state. There's been referendums trying to get Quebec to be a state or to be a country, but it's never been successful. So Quebec is a nation. It does meet all of the sociological elements needed to be defined as a nation, but it's not a country. And so because of this differing in definitions, using nation as synonym for country leads into confusion. When you say nation, are you talking about kind of the more sociological, so group with a shared identity on a particular territory, or are you talking about state as the sovereign kind of a political community with sovereignty and territoriality? Which are you talking about? So the easiest way is to keep nations for what we define here on this slide, and keep states for sovereignty, territoriality over a particular kind of the political community. Nation state is also another term that's often used. A nation state is a sovereign state based on people living in a country who share a sense of common identity as members of a nation. So a nation state occurs when a state or a country, all of the people within it are within, or not all of the people, the vast majority are members of a single nation. So, for example, if Quebec were a country, then you could say Quebec was a nation state, right? Because you'd have the Quebecois nation who live within the Quebec country. Now, as the problem with nation state, increasingly, nation states historically in the early years of nations, most states that existed were nation states. So early on, using nation states and states as synonymous made more sense. But in modern times, many states are not based on a single nation, as most countries have diverse populations. So more and more countries have more than one nation living within its territory. For a variety of reasons. Some it's just people move around a lot, so there's a lot of immigration in different places. So it's harder to just say everyone within a particular area is part of the same nation. Partially it's some of the later politics of how countries are formed. So either territories get seized in wars, or in colonial periods, kind of boundaries were drawn sometimes haphazardly at best. In certain cases, it was, boundaries were based on, a ship went down a river in Africa, and as far as the cannonball could land, it would fire cannonballs each direction, and where it landed is where the territorial boundary was. Well, distance of cannonball shots and where people with similar identities lived weren't necessarily the same. So you had many instances of kind of what you would think of as nations or people with shared ethnic or linguistic or cultural ties to land being split across different states. So for example, Canada, the UK, and Spain are examples of multinational states. So Canada, with Quebecois being a separate nation. In the UK, you'd have the English, the Scottish, the Welsh, and the Irish within the UK. So different nations within one state. So within a state, governments will often try to develop a national identity, so kind of a shared identity across all people. So they'll often put out deliberate efforts to replace local and regional dialects, so local versions of the language, culture, and identities with a national culture, right? So they'll try to homogenize people into speaking one particular language, having one particular culture and value, and this will be based on the dominant group. So part of what, say, many argued led to the rise in Quebec nationalism and the sense of Quebec needing to protect its national identity was a feeling that there's kind of a push of within Canada that French was becoming a second-class language even within Quebec. The culture within the country and even within Quebec was becoming more and more Anglo-Canadian, and the values were being set were more ones with the kind of the English-Canadian nation. And so there was kind of a homogenizing of the country going on where the values, the culture, the heritage of French Quebecois was more and more being replaced and lost. So the rise in Quebec nationalism was a pushback against this type of national identity. Now, in some cases it's done, this isn't always to say that development of national identities is done in a malicious manner of trying to stamp out others, right? It can be done in terms of trying to define a sense of self. So if you want to have sovereignty over a territory, if you want to have authority over a territory, well, that's a lot easier if you're viewed as legitimate authority, right? We talked last time about legitimacy. If you're perceived as the right to be ruling or the proper ruler. The more you have a shared identity within the state, the common set of values and culture about how things are done, the easier it is to have legitimacy, to have proper sovereignty within the state. So it's not necessarily always done with the goal of harming other groups. It could be done for the image of building. The idea could be kind of the aspirational goal of building a strong sense of self or cohesion within the state. And a strong sense of self for a nation isn't, or for a state, isn't a bad thing. So it's not necessarily always malicious done that trying to stamp out smaller groups. But it can have harm and it can push back, right? It does, homogenizing isn't always better. Homogenizing isn't always popular. And so it can be something that will lead to conflict. Nationalism. So nationalism is based on the view that the nation state is the best form of political community, that a nation should have its own self-governing state, and that the interests, culture, and values of the nation should be promoted. What's interesting here is that nationalism can be complicated, right? Like, so we could talk about Quebec nationalism, so a sense that uh, uh, view that, so again, so I'm not so in this definition from the textbook, I'm not so tied to using the term nation state there. Because for example, Quebec, the Quebecois can have nationalism. And that's not necessarily tied to the sense of Quebec needs to be a country. But it could be just viewed that the nation should be self-governing, not necessarily even a state. But more nationalism, it would be that the interests, culture, and values of the nation should be promoted. And I think that's the part where I think nationalism across different contexts really is a sense of pride in the culture and in the values of the nation. So a sense of like attachment to your group, and that there's a need to celebrate the group, not necessarily denigrating other groups and saying other groups are bad, but a sense of pride in your own group. It can be multifaceted, right? Someone can be a Quebec nationalist and a Canadian nationalist at the same time, right? Can have an attachment to both Quebec as a nation on a particular territory with a particular set of values, but also be proud of being part of the Quebec state or the Canadian state or the Canadian nation. So they're not necessarily, that's where I think it's opposed to say that it's necessarily tied to a nation state, because there's many people who are strong Quebec nationalists will be more tied to the idea of separatism, but you have some strong Quebec nationalists, for example, who are not separatists, who have strong also identity to Canada, and are proud Canadians and proud Canadian nationalists. So, and part of this is tied to two distinctive types of nationalism. So ethnic nationalism based on common ancestry along with cultural traditions and language associated with a particular ethnic group. So you can make the case for kind of a Quebec nationalism based on language associated, so culture and language associated with the Quebecois within Quebec. Um, and then civic nationalism based on shared political values and political history of those who are citizens of a country. So there's different bases for this feeling that the interests, culture, and values of the nation should be promoted. It could be based on just kind of a shared ethnic background, a shared linguistic or cultural traditions, common ancestry within a particular territory. So that's one form of where nationalism can come from. But the other could be that it could be a multinational state where it's not tied to any linguistic or necessarily cultural background, but just be based on shared political values and political history of those who are there. So people of many different ethnic or linguistic or religious backgrounds can be proud of how politics is done in Canada and the history, the shared history within Canada. And so they have civic nationalism. So again, so you could have a Quebec nationalist on ethnic grounds, but a Canadian nationalist on civic grounds, for example, would be entirely possible. Nationalism gets a bad name often, but nationalism in itself isn't necessarily bad. Nationalism is bad when the sense of promoting yourself, your pride in yourself, turns to not just promoting yourself, but looking down on others. So it turns from, so nationalism, if it's just saying, we're great, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. Nationalism becomes problematic when it gets to the form of, we're great and others are crap, or others are bad. That's where nationalism can be problematic and can lead to conflict, both within a state or outside of the state. That's where nationalism can be can lead to a lot of problems. But nationalism in and of itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. So while many states we've talked about kind of promote kind of a single national identity or national identity. Other states, instead of encouraging or persuading different ethnic, cultural, and linguistic groups to give up their distinctiveness and assimilate into the dominant group, so try to homogenize everyone, some countries have adopted a policy of multiculturalism. So an acceptance of difference, an acceptance of different languages, different cultures, different ethnicities, all with, and saying this is acceptable within our state. Official multiculturalism involves recognizing the cultural diversity of the country and providing encouragement and support for those of different cultures to help them retain and foster their cultures and traditions. So Canada has often portrayed itself as multicultural. And in some senses, that's fair. In some senses, it's not. It's fair in that it's certainly bicultural in the sense that, I mean, the official policy of the federal government is bilingualism. It's a multinational state with the Quebecois nation within it. There's also many First Nations within it, although the status and treatment of First Nations have often been so inferior to the treatment of other groups that to call it official, recognized kind of support of those different or encouraging of difference. And to say that there haven't been attempts at homogenization doesn't seem to fit reality. It's also groups beyond those two dominant groups. So support for languages beyond English and French is variable at best. The support for non-Western European ethnic groups is better than in some countries, but the claim that there's no assimilation attempts and that there's full celebration of distinctiveness, I think wouldn't fit the experience of many minority members of minority groups within Canada. So there may be an official multiculturalism in like policy, but in practice, it's more problematic. And even in terms of policy, Canada, in terms of its values, is so based on a particular ethno-linguistic, but also religious background. The Canadian Constitution and laws and history is so based on a Judeo-Christian background that to say it's fully open to other groups, the further those groups stray away from that Judeo-Christian background, the less openness you'll often see to multiculturalism. And this is particularly true that multiculturalism in general has been challenged more and more in recent years in many countries, particularly when it comes to immigration from certain groups, and particularly many Muslim countries, due to kind of the perceived threat to the nation's culture and political values. So kind of an idea that Islam isn't consistent with the Judeo-Christian values that inspired Canadian or many Western political values. So like I said, the further a group is perceived to be from the founding values, the more resistance there is to kind of multiculturalism, and more there's a desire to either not accept the group or to assimilate them. If you want to come here, you must act, speak and act like us. You must believe like us. Within states, citizenship becomes an important concept. Integral to the development of the modern state. Citizenship means that a country's permanent residents are full members of the political community with certain rights and duties. So these are the people who are perceived to be full members of the group. So citizenship can be established on many different bases. So it could be based on birth. So if you're born into a particular country, you're a citizen of that country. It could be based on a certain amount of time that you spent there. So if you move to a country and you spend a certain enough time and you integrate sufficiently, you can take a citizenship test and become a citizen. Sometimes it's based on having to achieve or do a particular service. So you, even people who are born in a country, it may be that they'd be given citizenship, say, only after military service. So even people who live there, and unless they've done military service, they don't have all of the full rights of membership within the political community. You're allowed to live there, right? But you don't have the full rights. So rights is an important part that comes with citizenship, right? So kind of like if you look at the laws that say in terms of human rights within the country or political rights within the country, the right to vote for, say, in a democracy is limited to citizens. So if you're a citizen, you get to select who participates in the government. If you're not a citizen, you don't get to choose. So those are certain rights that are protected only for citizens. There's often certain duties, right? There's certain things that you're supposed to do. So again, returning to voting, in some democracies, it's law that you must vote because that's viewed as the duty of citizenship. You get all these benefits of being a citizen. In return, you have to do certain things. In other cases, it might be something like citizens may be eligible for jury duty. So you may have to sometimes serve on a jury, or there could be other duties that are required. In most countries, once you've achieved citizenship, it cannot be revoked, particularly citizenship based on birth, where you're a citizen of only one country. Key issues include what are the obligations to the political community, so being a citizen, what responsibilities, what are the duties that are held, and equality of membership within the community. So are there different tiers of citizens? Are some citizens treated better than others? So some get, even among the citizens, do some get more rights than others? But also what are the, what happens to those who are excluded from the group? So for the most part, governments have the power, so states have the power to, like we said, control, are sovereign over what happens within their territory and free from external actors, right, from outside influence. Globalization is something that has put pressure on the ability of states to be fully sovereign over their territory. So globalization has brought a lot of great things, but some challenges for the states and for the people who live within them as well. So what is globalization? So it's the integration of markets, finance, and technologies in a way that is shrinking the world from a size medium to a size small and enabling each of us to reach around the world farther, faster, and cheaper than ever before. So it's kind of the shrinking of the world through technology, often through technology. So increase in global trade, increase in interconnection. All right, so often when we talk about this interconnectedness, we're talking about economic, political, and cultural. And reaching farther, faster, and cheaper than ever before, right? So think about cheaper. Now you can gain goods cheaper than you could in the past because we're not just dealing with goods that are produced in a small area. You know, historically, forget about even just within Canada, you'd be buying goods that were produced just within your local region within the country. Then, and with increasing technology, you were getting products from a wider geographical range. Now you're getting products produced around the world. And that leads to a decreasing the price. Farther, so again, we're not dealing with goods, connections with just your neighboring countries. You're dealing with connections to everyone around the world, and faster. Just everything's faster. Products arrive faster than they used to. Now everything is 1 or 2 day shipping. So it's just a change, and that's all kind of on the economic side. Think about communications, right? In the past, if you wanted to communicate to somebody internationally, you had to send a letter, and say you wanted to send a letter to Europe 100 years ago, or communicate with somebody in Europe 100 or 200 years ago. You'd send a letter that would take weeks to get there because it would be sent by boat across the ocean. Now, if you want to communicate to somebody in Europe, you pick up your phone and you get on Skype or Zoom, or if you just want to chat on WhatsApp or a different app, or Facebook or whatever it is, any of these different apps, and you can be communicating with them. You can, be having video chat with somebody who lives around the world, where before you'd barely get to know this person. You could have very little capacity to know them. Now they can attend your birthday party. If you have grandparents who live around the world, they can attend your birthday party via, Skype. That's completely different than it used to be. And again, so it's not only faster and cheaper, but it's also further, right? Your social network used to be, the communication that you used to have would be very limited in global scope. It would be you'd have friends and family within a particular region. If anybody lived outside of that region, you'd hear from them and see them extremely rarely, because of the amount of time it took for communication and the difficulty of traveling. Now you can communicate with anybody anywhere. And the last example in terms of travel, right? Think of the trips that now some of you would have been able to take, and think of even 50 years ago, how difficult it would have been to travel to the extent that now we take for granted. Well, I suppose in COVID, we've kind of had to appreciate, with it being harder to travel, we've had to kind of maybe appreciate it a little bit more, how rare that experience can be, or how privileged we are to have those experiences of international travel or traveling across the country. But in times past, that was, very few people got to travel to a different continent. But now that's something that many people get to experience, and it's far cheaper, it's far faster. It used to be you'd have, again, take a boat if you wanted to cross the ocean. Now you just fly. So many different changes. And the last, then again, is cultural. With all of this sharing of communication, sharing of technology, right? It's made, with increased communication, leads to increased homogenization. We're all buying the same products, right? It used to be you'd have so many different products because you'd be buying only local products. There'd be increased variation in them. You'd be consuming media, newspapers or radio programs that were produced, or early television ones that were only produced locally. Now you can get, print media or online media, or television shows or films from all around the world. So those who have become the specialist in producing cultural products, right? They have a greater reach, and it poses a greater challenge to the local culture producers of cultural products, because they have competition from better funded and more bigger competition. So in terms of different forms of economic globalization, so corporations have become global, and global trade has increased greatly since the 1950s, right? So we're seeing an increase in global spread of products around the world. Tends to reduce the ability of national governments to manage their own economies. We'll return to that one in a couple of slides. So I'll leave that one for a second, because I do want to show states are still the strongest actor in global politics, but particularly with smaller states, the spread of trade and products around the world does produce challenges to them. cultural globalization. So advances in communication allowed wider distribution of cultural products, and it's often typically Western products around the world. In terms of cultural globalization, this is where we've seen some of the conflicts in other parts of the world. Some of the rises in, for example, terrorism in certain parts of the world, or anti-Western sentiments in certain part of the world. To a certain extent, it has to do with political and economic globalization, but oftentimes some of the biggest sources are in terms of challenges, cultural challenges to their language, identity, religion, and a pushback against that. Whenever you have attempted homogenization from the groups that are getting pushed out, you're going to provoke backlash, right? People who they don't want to be homogenized, they like their current identity. And so they'll fight against it. And then political globalization. So globalization has led to the need for international institutions. So organizations like the UN or International Monetary Fund to help manage international issues. Whenever you have more communication, more travel, more kind of just spread across the world, interconnectedness around the world, it leads to greater global challenges, which leads to a need for institutions or organizations to deal with it. So, like I said, the United Nations, global financial institutions, global NGOs, so the non-governmental ones like Amnesty International, have all kind of taken up and have all been created, and all will put pressure on states in different issues. Also, in terms of kind of a side part of political globalization or other challenges, ones that don't fit as neatly into these three, but I would put kind of under political globalization, is even things like spread of disease, right? With increased travel, increased connectedness means that diseases that emerge in one part of the world will now within days weeks will spread around the world, where it used to take decades or certainly years before a disease could spread around the world, or often it may not spread around the world. Now it can do so within days. And so that creates increased political problems. So with all things globalization, it's interesting when you talk about globalization. You have many people, if you talk to people just like your friends or family, and you ask them about globalization, many of them will come down on globalization's great. And then many of them will come down on globalization's terrible. You don't get many people who say it's both, which is sad because that's the true answer. But people often, because of the nature of politics, like to take on a particular, view it through a particular lens. So those who say it's terrible look at homogenizing cultural, or look at the negative effects of economic globalization. So the people who lost their job because of free trade, or they'll look at different political pressures coming in on the state, and they'll say, oh, look at how these other organizations are coming in and telling us how we should run our lives. So they'll look at it from that side only, but leave out the good side of, like, you could travel the world now, you can see it, you can get access as a consumer, it's a dream. You get access to products you could have never had before. You can communicate with people that you could have never before. You could learn things and experience things that you never could have before. And so those on the globalization is great. Just look at that side and kind of ignore the downside. In reality, it's created a great number of opportunities. It's also created a great number of challenges. And you have to take the one with the other, and manage the challenges as best you can while enjoying the opportunities as best you can. So although states remain strong, some assert that globalization is eroding their power by shifting power upwards to, like we said, because of political globalization, to international institutions, increasing the reach of global markets and power of global corporations, and stimulating separatist movements. So again, separatist movements could be part of political globalization, where you're finding out, hey, self-determination, other groups have gotten self-determination for their group, or push back against kind of homogenizing Western influence, influence of Western culture, increasing the reach and global power of corporations. So that's what I want to end on. So this here is a list of the 100, so it's a few years old, so I think this is around 2012 or 2013, but the idea won't have changed. The orders will have changed, but the idea won't have. Because the ordering of states will be relatively the same. The ordering of corporations would have definitely changed over this amount of time. But from, I believe it was 2012 or 2013, this is the top 100 countries or corporations in terms of revenue. So state revenue or corporation revenue. So if we look through, we've got the US, China, Germany, Japan, France, UK, Italy, Brazil, Canada in ninth, and Walmart. So right behind Canada and before Spain is Walmart. Then Australia, Netherlands, State Grid, Chinese National Petroleum, Sinopec Group, South Korea. Then we've got Shell, Mexico, Sweden, ExxonMobil, Volkswagen, Toyota, India, Apple, Belgium. So Toyota so Apple being sandwiched between India and Belgium in terms of revenue. And so I believe in this list of 100, 73 of them are corporations, and the remainder, so 27 of them are states. So think that there's 193 states in the UN, and hundreds of more corporations. So think about how small some of those would be, or how far down this list some of those, some of the smallest states would be. So there's many things that a state can do that a corporation can never do, even the biggest ones that Walmart could never do. There's certain functions that a state can do that Walmart could never do. But there's other things that, take, so Walmart, who's number one on that year's list, and with its revenue of, let's see, it looks like 482 billion, it looks like a billion US dollars. So think of that country like that, and even let's take the Portugal at 90. What if, and Portugal is still a relatively big country, right? What if Walmart goes to Portugal and say Portugal is in the middle of a recession, and Walmart says, we'll build a factory or in Portugal that'll bring you in another 10 billion $10 billion dollars to the state. How do you think Portugal's? We'll do that, but first you have to change this law for us, because we don't like this law. We can't come here if you've got this law. Looking at Portugal's revenue and what they could do with that extra 10 billion, kind of a percentage of their total revenue, what do you think Portugal says? And then Portugal is a relatively big state. Think about one then that's around, say, 150 in the list of total countries. So Portugal here's about 27 on the list of countries. Think about a country that's is 150 on the list of countries. So maybe it's got revenues in the $10 million range. And Walmart comes in and says, we'll build something that'll bring your revenue up by 10 billion. So essentially in that case, doubling their revenue. But we need you to do this, 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 and this, and this for us. Those, human rights or those workers' rights laws that you've got, those got to go, or we need exceptions for them. What do you think the government says to that? Can they say no? I mean, they can, they've got sovereignty, but they need the jobs for their people. They need the revenue to do things. Many of those countries are incredibly poor. They're fragile states. They need to build infrastructure. They need to build health care. They need to build education to improve, the potential of their state. If a company's going to come in and say, we're going to give you this much money, how can the state say no to it? That gives corporations a lot of power, particularly over the smaller states, but even over bigger states. Can give them a lot of power in to change policies and for them to not be fully sovereign, because an external actor can come in and dictate what rules they set in the country. All right, so that's all for today. I will see you for the next class.